So good morning. Welcome to the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney, and I'm the recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist Community. The Humanist Community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist Community if you've not already done so. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. If you are listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website again, humanist.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist Community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on the website humanist.org. Also, our treasurer has just posted all the information you need to, if you want to mail a check to our organization. Also, it's the end of the year, so memberships need to be renewed. You can find out more about renewing memberships at, it looks like, humanist.org/blog/membership. All right, so our speaker today is Jerry Pannone. We'll discuss the good, the bad, the ugly, a brief history of California K-12 education. Jerry is a professional musician, a retired music and humanities teacher who taught elementary through high school in Oakland, San Francisco, and San Mateo. He retired from the San Francisco School of the Arts High School. Okay. Jerry, let me unmute you. Okay, you're asked to unmute. You have to unmute yourself, Jerry.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for the invitation. Just a little background. I was a music teacher for 40 years and spent the last 30 at the School of the Arts High School in San Francisco. I taught elementary through high school in Oakland, San Mateo, and again, ending in San Francisco. I retired in 2009 and continued to volunteer in both music and humanities at that school. We where school started back in 1987 and grew from just a couple hundred kids to about 800. It's a magnet school, so kids have to audition to get into it in any one of about 8 art forms. Lucky in the sense that kids really wanted to be there. So since I taught a number of years in places kids didn't want to be, it was kind of a pleasure to be in a school where kids really enjoyed being there. I want to focus this talk on generally California education, but you can't separate California's education with what else was going on in the country. And a little bit about the crisis California is in now as far as education. I'd like to show a video. It's called California Education Budget Crisis, and that'll give you kind of what's happening today. And for those of you who are interested in, why we don't have enough money in schools and all that, this gives kind of a background to that. So if we can play that one first, that would be great. And please forgive the ads and that sort of thing that come ahead. So that would be the first video that's lined up, California Education Budget Crisis.
State takeover,
I'm not hearing any sound.
School budget disaster. We've all seen startling headlines in recent years about some school districts across California. But what does it all mean?
We're 41st in the nation in what we spend per kid. In California, I mean, the richest state, in the richest nation on the face of the earth, And the pathetic funding that we have per pupil is something that's got to be dealt with.
With more than 6 million students and 1,100 school districts, California has the largest public school system in the country. But some school districts are struggling financially.
Will you see more enter into this general category of fiscal distress? Yes, you will.
We've enjoyed the longest economic growth period in California since World War II. Yet hundreds of school districts are cutting their budgets. So what's the problem here? The problem here is that what we're not doing in a growing economy is investing in education. We're just not doing it.
According to many in education, the problem also has to do with the state increasing the financial burden on districts at a time when many districts face declining revenue. While each district faces unique challenges, experts agree there are some common factors contributing to the budget crisis in California's schools. Factor number one, the pension system.
Most teachers are in the CalSTRS system, and Jerry Brown, the governor at the time a few years ago, realized, of course, we need to put more money into the system. So they raised the contribution for districts over time so that districts would have time to build that increase into their budget.
That increase will more than double what districts are required to contribute to employee pensions, going from 8.3% of their payroll in the 2013-2014 school year to 19.1% by 2021.
They want you to have the money today for the person that you hire today so that when they retire, the money will be there.
In his first year in office, California Governor Gavin Newsom pledged $3 billion to help offset the large increase in pension costs school districts are having to pay. District officials say it's a step in the right direction, but it still isn't enough. Contributing factor number two, declining enrollment.
About 60% of school districts in California are declining enrollment, and that's a significant issue because their revenue from the state is tied to enrollment and attendance.
Many parents in financially strapped districts are moving their kids to charter or private schools, and it's happening at a rapid pace. Adding to the financial pressure is the way schools are funded, on a per-pupil, per-day basis. For each child who misses a day of school, the district receives less money, even though they're paying the same amount for the teacher and the classroom. Contributing factor number three, the increasing costs of everything.
We are seeing increased costs on so many fronts. We're experiencing an increase in our pension costs. We are experiencing an increase in our healthcare costs. We are also seeing an increase just in the cost of doing business.
According to Sacramento Unified School District officials, those increases have put them $35 million in the red.
Currently, Sac City Unified spends 91 cents of every dollar on employee benefits and salaries, and we're trying to work with our labor partners to lower that to the state average of 86 cents per dollar, or even lower if we can.
The simple solution seems to be, well, the largest chunk of the budget are teacher salaries, so let's cut teacher salaries and we'll save the money. That's not the solution, and very rarely is.
There are consequences if they don't ultimately stabilize.
Michael Fine leads the organization tasked with keeping school districts out of financial trouble. It's called FCMAT, which stands for Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team. They work with troubled districts to find options for recovery. Districts that still struggle after several FCMAT warnings may face what many call a state takeover. The official term, insolvency.
When a school district has insufficient cash to meet payroll, and they have exhausted all of their cash borrowing options, then that's the definition of insolvency.
At that point, the district is forced to ask the state for a loan. That loan triggers a transfer of governing authority. Until the fall of 2018, that authority was transferred to the state. That's why you hear it called a state takeover. In 2018, the process was changed, giving counties the authority and requiring them to appoint an outside administrator to govern the district.
Generally, the superintendent is dismissed, and that administrator that the county superintendent assigns then becomes the board, the superintendent, and they go to work solving the budget problems.
They look at cutting all expenses that aren't mandatory.
Higher class sizes, fewer resources for the students, all those kinds of things. And it also burdens the district with loans that take them years to pay off.
Well, state takeover would be not good for our students or families, and that's why we're trying to do everything we can to avoid it.
Officials familiar with the process say insolvency ends up costing school districts far more after paying back the loan and millions of dollars in interest. There's also concern that an outside administrator would be focused on the fiscal solvency of the district and not on the classroom.
The main concern as a parent is for the long term, the future students coming into the Sac City Unified School District.
There's been talk that if the state takes over, then we'll have a lot less money than we already do right now. And if that happens, then we're going to have to make a lot of cuts.
With all the people leaving, I mean, you're just going to be left with, schools that are not well taken care of. And then now you've got maybe less, teachers and other cutbacks. And so bigger class sizes. So yeah, it's just going to be a horrible situation.
But despite what sounds like a gloomy situation, experts in education say there are signs that the tide could be turning. They're actually optimistic.
It gives me great optimism to see a governor who says in his State of the State address, the first governor in decades to actually acknowledge that we've got a problem with per pupil funding and something has to be done about it.
Since 1991, we've had 9 school districts and 1 community college district that didn't respond to the intervention. To have 9 in 27, 28 years, I think is probably a pretty good record. It's actually a reflection that the system's working.
I believe that we are on the verge, because of all the changes we've made, of doing some really exciting things in California, differently than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, well, that was before COVID. That was made last year. And so it's not taking into account what the schools are going through and what kids are going through now with all the, video learning and Zoom learning that's happening, which is difficult for lots of parents as well as lots of kids. I wanted to just show that first because that's kind of where the schools are now with their budgets. But, how did we essentially get here? It actually started back in the 50s. California was ranked tops, either 1 through 5, for years and years. And that happened after the war, after World War II, and going into the baby boomers. This next video, I think you'll get a kick out of because it, for some of us, we can see ourselves in those classrooms in those spots because it's about the 50s and the baby boom generation and what it did to education. So if we can play that one, I think you'll enjoy this bit, about 7 minutes of it.
The baby boom.
Babies all over the map.
The post-World War II rise of the middle class had produced a huge number of babies, the largest generation in world history. All of these young people had been causing a huge overcrowding before Sputnik, and schools had been straining to the breaking point.
Your child's school nearly doubled its enrollment.
The result? Classroom shortage.
There weren't enough classrooms and desks.
They gave my boy half a seat.
To give every student some kind of education, many schools had resorted to teaching kids in shifts.
Oh, too bad.
Students sat at their desks for just 2 hours and then went home. And other students replaced them at those same desks, up to 4 times a day. Classes met wherever there was room, even in barber shops. The baby boomers were stressing the entire system, but this was hardest on the teachers. Overworked and underpaid, just when we needed more of them, many teachers were quitting.
With deep regret, I hereby submit my resignation as a teacher in the school system for the forthcoming year, for reasons...
Teachers tried to keep control of classrooms of 30 to 60 students and were forced to spend more and more of their time just being disciplinarians.
Keeping discipline had become one of the biggest chores of the crowded classroom.
Mike, Fred.
And those that persevered resorted to teaching their huge classes of students by rote.
And so, to control the crowd, to hold their attention, Miss Roberts was forced to return to whole group instruction, teaching the mass instead of the individual, teaching by rote.
1, 2, 3, 4. Put your feet on the floor. 1, 2.
Teaching no longer stimulating to the pupils or the teacher.
The slow learners aren't getting the attention they need, and the bright ones are bored.
And it gets worse every day. But for the time being, we've got to live with it, doing the best job we can.
Even if it's a bad job?
All we can do for the present is try the best we know how.
To leave no stone unturned in our self-examination, leaders traveled to Russia to look at their educational system, to see what they were doing that was different. What we found shocked us.
30 years ago, we had 6 times as many scientists and engineers as the Soviet Union. Now their colleges are turning out twice as many technical people this year as ours are.
In the Soviet time, the science was a priority in the society. It was not a movie star, it was not the rich man, it was no rich man there, it was you have to be scientist.
We learned that Russian kids went to school 6 days a week, that their school year was 213 days long compared to 180 days in America, that every Russian kid, boy and girl, was required to take math and engineering. Russian students had up to 4 hours of homework a night, where the average in America was just 30 minutes.
The top-notch minds are attracted to the physical sciences and mathematics. Their skills are so highly valued that no expense is spared in providing them with excellent technical facilities.
Take something like the Russian satellite to put the finger on what's wrong with our education.
We need scientists, we need technicians, we need mathematicians. There's no doubt about that.
The community's awake now. I think they're going to try to do something. They're all excited about science and math. I mean, it's been taken for granted for so long. Now, suddenly, it's back in the spotlight again.
Education was in the spotlight, and the lessons we took away from the Soviet system were plain and simple.
We got to do something, and we need an educated population science to be able to do this. And it was like somebody slammed on the accelerator, and all of a sudden, everything was open for discussion and examination.
We've come face to face with the realization that schools and survival are inseparable.
The time has come for a change.
We have to reorganize our schools.
Within just months of the failure of Vanguard, America began to do something remarkable, something that few other nations would have been capable of. We began to come together, to become unified in our determination to fix what was broken.
We don't have an adequate education program in any of our schools.
Are you satisfied? Are you really satisfied that your school and your community is doing all that it can do for these youth?
Thousands of children are getting a shoddy education. The time has come for America to realize that our citadel now is the intelligence, imagination, and curiosity of the trained mind. The American people must improve their public schools to make the nation strong to meet whatever threat may come.
Each citizen should do what he can to strengthen American education.
to make the position and prestige of the teacher understood in the community. This I think they can do and they must do.
We were on a national mission. A mission that is today referred to as the Sputnik Moment.
The search for an education which will develop the full potentiality of every boy and girl.
We had to find
that's probably good at that point.
And we needed to enlist more of them. The number of students per class had to be reduced.
Yeah, so I think our educational system basically responds to crisis, and it's been responding to crisis for years. It's kind of like you folks who have seen that whack-a-mole game, on boardwalks in Santa Cruz. The mole, pops up, and you try to hit it with a club, and pops up somewhere else. And so, at least my experience with California, particularly California's education, is that we see a crisis and we wait till it's really in full bloom before we try to do anything about it. Now, the 50s dumped a lot of money into education, and class sizes were reduced. Again, science and math were brought up. It was a Sputnik moment where suddenly we became afraid of the Russians. One of the last comments in the film was, it was survival, because we recognized the Russians were way ahead of us. And so we put a lot of energy, the country came together, and we had the goal of improving education. Well, that went on through the 50s and into the beginning of the 60s. But the problem was, despite the fact that we were putting a lot of energy into education, it was still a kind of rote learning system. And along came Benjamin Bloom at Vanderbilt University and came up with Bloom's taxonomy, and a better way to learn and a better way to teach. We start thinking about critical thinking, not just learning by rote. And that caught on first in the universities, and particularly at Berkeley. And most of you who were here at that point, this 1964, remember the free speech movement. We have a video on that, but I'm going to skip that one. Just talk about it a bit. So can I get an idea of how many folks remember that free speech movement, or just by a kind of a wave of the hand? Yeah. And Governor Brown at that time, Pat Brown, was in charge of everything. And it was kind of a crazy time for people, because the universities never basically revolted about anything. There were always peaceful things, discussions were had, and folks seemed to get along. But the free speech movement was breaking that mold. They were basically questioning, why can't we question? Why is it always the sage on the stage that gets the juice, and we can't talk about anything, form other groups? Well, that was the beginning of that free speech movement. Mario Savio was the main leader. Whole lot of people got arrested, hundreds of people in demonstrations. And finally, the faculty voted to support the students. And that was one of the biggest events that was happening during that period. Well, eventually it started to affect the other schools. Its teachers, the K-12 schools were affected, and it started something totally new, which brought us into the 60s movement. And I think what went along with that was the concept that everything was everything. You could believe whatever you wanted. There began to be a decline in religion, the religious influences with a lot of kids. And you had a kind of a moral relativism started to creep into the educational system. And there's a good and downside, upside and downside to that. So what we are now is in a place where nothing took the place of the structure of these kids that were coming from religious homes. Because even the idea that you would teach secular ethics was put down in the schools. I remember when I got out of college, we had to take a class called Values Clarification. I don't know if any of you had to take a course like that, but it was basically discovering what your own values were and could you transmit those values if you were a teacher, or how they would be represented. And you had to be very careful because everybody was ready to jump on any kind of ethical training in schools, character training, anything like that, because we were in the midst of that kind of moral relativism. But that fact basically ate away at a lot of the structure in the schools. When I just started teaching, I think it was 1975, I was teaching at Portola Junior High School in San Francisco. They still had a paddle in those days. Anybody remember the vice principal having a paddle? And every you walk down the hall and want to hear a whack and a kid holler. And that was still going. So you had the end of corporal punishment in schools and a move away from that into this period of a moral relativism. So it just was either or in a lot of places until finally they got rid of the paddle, which was a good thing. But that kind of structure in schools also started to deteriorate. San Francisco, for example, and most of the city schools had a structure where the kids understood what was going on. And even when what you call the inner city tough schools, there was a structure in those schools that allowed everybody to kind of know where they were. That began to fall apart. And the inner city schools got worse. The suburban schools got better because what happened then was Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 basically, I would say, crashed education in California. The budget during up through the 1970s was approximately $9 billion a year. After Prop 13, it went to $6 billion. So a third of the budget was cut immediately in 1 year. What happened was massive cuts in faculty. I'm just going to run down what happened at that point. All the vocational ed classes disappeared. Music and art classes were all reduced. End of a 7-period day. High schools all had 7-period days. That was dropped to 6-period days. The administrative staff was reduced. School nurses and librarians, for the most part, were gone. After school programs, including sports programs, were cut. All dances, field trips were gone. Janitorial services were reduced. School maintenance was deferred. And you had buildings basically starting to fall apart. Local libraries used to have classes after school, so kids could go to the libraries and the school district would pay for them. That was all gone. So essentially, California, that was on top, was dropping to the bottom. And it has never caught up. The music classes were all reduced. For example, in every middle school, you would have 3 music teachers, orchestra, band, and a choir. It went down to 1 music teacher. You had 3, 4 art classes, dropped down to 1 teacher. Language classes were reduced. So, we were at the top, and then we went to the bottom pretty quickly. And it's been playing catch up since then. Now, something also interesting happened. You had a flight to the suburbs because people want to have some control over their kids' education. And you, coupled with Prop 13, you had busing. So kids in city schools often were bused from a school that might be across the street to across town. for desegregation reasons. Parents obviously didn't like that. The program failed after a point anyway, but it carried on enough so you had a flight to private schools as well as down the peninsula where schools were growing. The budget essentially was barely growing at all, went down, dropped by $1,000 per kid. And people felt, well, what are we paying for with these taxes? And since they could go to a peninsula school or outside of a city and have more control, that's where people started going. Now, it also brought up something that people don't like to think about. That was essentially the schools were prejudiced. You had black kids and brown kids being tracked into those vocational ed classes and not into college track classes. And so you had eventually a rebellion against that, if you were taking your kid to a private school, you didn't have to worry about it. You had the increase in costs for special education. Now they say that 11% of the kids in public school have autism problems or some other special education problem that the school has to pay for. So although they might say the ratio of teacher to student is 21 or 22 to 1, it actually, if you walked into most social studies classes or math classes, you're probably going to see 30, 35 there because the special ed class has to take a much smaller ratio because the kids need a lot more attention. The other thing is that private schools don't have to take care of any of that. So if you have a special ed child, they're not going to get any attention in most private schools. The pay now, I mean, getting to a point where we look at the budget itself, if you're down here in Silicon Valley, Los Gatos, Saratoga High School District, for example, the per pupil spending is $14,500. It's over or almost $2,000 more than the state gets, which gets about $12,500 for each kid. But if you're in, one of the city schools, you're liable to be getting that $12,500. A good chunk of it is going to go to administration and other costs. And so the kid gets far less of that dollar that, we're putting into them. Your school, if you're down here, you've got more say. And, like in real estate, they say, the 3 rules of real estate are location, location, location. In school, it's parents, parents, parents. If you have no parent involvement, then the school runs as best it can, and there's no pressure being put on that faculty or that administrator. But if you're in a good school, the parents' organizations are very strong. They're not going to stand for a poor teacher lasting very long in that school. They're not going to stand for a poor administrator. You have some clout there. And ultimately, your job as a parent is your child. That's the first job. People often don't think about somebody else's child. They think about their own first. And so that's an important factor in everybody's thinking process and budgeting in their own mind about who they want to pay for. Most people want to pay for their own kid first. And that dominoes down to where that kid who doesn't have an involved parent, there's very little money being sent to that child. One school I taught in San Francisco, when they had an open house, a parent house, if you shot a shotgun down the hallway, the only person you'd hit was a teacher because parents just didn't show up. Well, you can imagine you're going to get less qualified teachers in schools like that, and the kid ends up being the one who's suffering. But if you were to design a school and say, even a kid who doesn't have, the support systems that maybe your child had, well, what would you do? How would you put it together? Lots of people have these ideas, how we're going to make a better school. Oftentimes the teachers are blamed that they're not getting more out of that particular kid. But the old story is it takes a village to raise a child. And that's true. Even if your village is kind of loosely organized around, if I knock on 10 doors, I hit an engineer every time. Yeah, I'm 2 blocks from Apple. And just about everybody around is a scientist or an engineer. Well, that's a community, right? That's a community, a class of people that exists as a community, and that's the village. So if you have those values, you're going to send your kid to a school that represents that community. And that kid is probably going to be pretty good. He's probably going to go through school, have a lot of advantages, and do fairly well. But if you don't have that, you have to ask yourself, well, how do we deal with the other kids who don't have those supports? And one thing I think is important to look at, we're just like the 50s, just like that idea that it's a Sputnik moment and we have to come together. Because I don't know about you guys, but this is the worst period of political history I've ever seen. And, how do we come together? Well, if people are on vastly different universes, as they are here and today, you have to figure out how we're going to bring some folks up to certain levels of understanding. So I just like to show this last video about the Harlem Children's Zone. Jeffrey, I don't know if you guys know anything about it. Jeffrey Canada started this organization with a friend of his who was a billionaire. And they basically looked at Harlem and said, how can we do something about it? Jeffrey Canada grew up in the South Bronx. His grandparents moved him to a middle-class school in the suburbs. Then he got to go to college, which he wouldn't have done if he stayed in the South Bronx. And he ended up getting a doctorate at Harvard in education. There he met a friend who was wealthy, and he decided to go to Harlem and try to change a neighborhood. And this concept that it takes a village to raise a child is what he knew very well. He said, if you've got a kid for 5 hours in school, you send him home and there's gangs on the street, he hears shooting and all of that business, how can he get an education? How can he struggle? We like to think of, the old West, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But how many people do that? You got a very small number of people that actually do that without supports all around them. So Jeffrey Canada started this, and I'd like to show you this video. The best one out on it was done by 60 Minutes, and Anderson Cooper did it. I think it was 2013, but it's an excellent video if you get a chance to check it out on YouTube about what they've done here. And that's the kind of thing that personally gives me hope, that there are people recognizing that you have to change the community. So if we could see that last video, that'd be great. Unfortunately, they clip it in a frame, but I think you'll get the idea from it.
Harlem is a magical place to me. You just always hear music. Every single day you're gonna hear music.
When I think about Harlem, I think about the phoenix that rose from the ashes.
I describe Harlem as a family.
I'm definitely proud of being from Harlem. I wouldn't want to be from anywhere else.
And it said it take a village to raise the children. Harlem Children's Zone was our village. And I knew somewhere down that somebody was gonna do something good for Harlem.
Harlem has always been the epicenter of black culture.
Harlem was a place where a lot of black people were able to climb up out of the negative space.
When people thought about the future of black people, they thought it was going to happen in Harlem.
These blocks are literally history lessons in terms of who lived here, the work that was done, the fun. It was happening in Harlem. But then something happened.
It started with poverty and it ended with drugs. Harlem was clearly falling down and you could see the decay.
At the time, about 1 in 10 children in Central Harlem were going into foster care.
Harlem had abandoned buildings and trash all over everywhere. This sends a signal to kids. No one cares about you. Here, your life is a toss-up.
We're looking at the prison to be a panacea for all that ailed the community. In many instances, society chases smoke, but refuses to put out the fire. Reedland began to develop programs that address the fire and not the smoke.
I don't know about you, but I'm tired of hearing about my children dying in New York, and the children dying in Boston, and the children dying in Philadelphia. I think it's time for some of us to stand up and rebuild America community by community.
Marian Wright Edelman had pulled together about 20, 25 leaders from across the country to talk about the plight of black children.
And we would go off into a retreat. It's Alex Haley's farm after he wrote Roots.
And Marian said, Jeff, this is it. This is where we're going to launch our crusade.
Thus began the Harlem Children's Zone.
We thought that it may not be easy, but it had to be us. We were willing to put whatever it takes to make a change here in Harlem.
Doing any one thing was simply not going to allow children to reach their full potential. I've been trying to figure out how to meet some people who could help us with this mission, and someone said, well, do you know Stan Druckenmiller? Stan Druckenmiller has more money than God.
And I said, Jeff, that's like the most fantastic, unbelievable vision I've ever heard. It's a little crazy, but I'm willing to bet on it. I was all in.
Jeff said, if you put this money in, I promise you we will deliver these results. And if we don't, you can essentially have your money back.
What we were trying to do here at the Harlem Children's Zone was to create a counter narrative to what people thought about black and brown children in Harlem or in any other community around this nation, because we think we have a model that can be replicated in other places.
And that's why, when I'm president of the United States of America, the first part of my plan to combat urban poverty will be to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone in 20 cities across the country.
Hi guys. Good morning. The ultimate goal of the Harlem Children's Zone is to end generational poverty. We definitely feel like we are doing that because we are sending hundreds of young people off to college and connecting them to a livable wage in a way that didn't happen before.
Being in an environment with individuals that care so much about the students that we serve, the families that we serve, that care so much about the mission, have personal stories that connect them to the work that we do, that really sacrifice so much on behalf of the children and families of Harlem. Like, this is the environment I wanted to be put in.
This is it. We are finally done forever. But not done forever because you know HCZ follows you for the rest of your life.
When I go in and I see those kids walking across that stage, I say to myself, we did good.
Okay, they leave off one thing in the narrative. Why did Harlem go from a viable community to a slum? Ironically, it was integration. And the civil rights movement allowed people basically to move where you wanted to. Prior to that, you had a community in Harlem that had the full spectrum of professions. You had doctors, lawyers, businessmen, the politicians. They were all from the community. You got to know who they were. And that was the village that kept the community together and viable. When the civil rights movement came along, ironically, people could move out. And just like lots of people, Italians in North Beach moved down to San Mateo. Asians that were caught in Chinatown moved out. So everybody wants a better life for themselves, but we don't always think about what's happening to the community when we move out. And that was one of the problems that happened to Harlem. Well, Jeffrey Canada came in and said, we've got all these whack-a-mole issues that, the kid has problems. He's falling into gangs. Well, we got to get him out of the gang. What he realized was his trajectory came because he got out, went to a middle-class school, went to college, and got a doctorate. And how are you going to get kids to do that? You can't get them all out that way. So he decided the best way to do it was to change the culture of the neighborhood. And so the Harlem Children's Zone basically is a cradle to career promise they're making and made good on it for hundreds and hundreds of students. So, as a mother, even if you're a single mom, you can go to them and they're going to give you all the care you need in getting yourself together, getting a job, getting childcare. It costs money. Each kid costs them $16,000 a year. I think New York today, that was probably 10 years ago, 16,000. It's over 20 now, because New York pays higher than any other place. It's $24,000 a year per student. So they get a lot of money compared to what we get. We get half of that. And so they have plenty of money to deal with. But even with that, they raise money for this Harlem Children's Zone. And they promise that if you are willing to be in there, spend the time, they're going to be with you all the way through college. And like I say, they flatten the disparity between white testing and Asian and black and brown testing, which used to be huge. They flattened it out. The test scores are the same now, and they've even exceeded many of the white schools. So that's one way I think we address education, which is happening sporadically around the country, still not in San Francisco, still not really in Oakland. So California, again, is behind the curve in this. Well, what's that? That has to do with those folks. We've got a problem with the other kids, though. And the problem with the other kids is that character development that I alluded to before. You have kids now that think nothing of cheating. There was a recent study done by KQED on ethics and said 51% of kids admit to cheating on tests. And Stanford did a study also of their students and said, how many of you cheated in high school? 60% that went to Stanford. Well, I guess it's a bigger prize, so you're willing to take a bigger chance to get into Stanford. But that's a major problem, because what's it's doing today to our business area. When we see the head of Facebook in a Senate committee answering questions about what Facebook is doing. So the other end, basically our end, where we're dealing with middle-class kids, what are we doing to enforce any kind of character development? Right now, it's nothing, I can tell you that, for most schools, but some schools are addressing the issue. And this, to me, is the perfect spot for humanists to jump in. It's saying, secular ethics is something that can replace that structure that fell apart in lots of places. And it's just, maybe it's more important for the middle-class kid and the wealthy kid who's going to be the CEOs of tomorrow to have a strong ethical sense than it is even for some of these other kids who have far more critical real world, or should we say third world problems to deal with. But if as the kind of educated class and those who are concerned about ethical behavior, if we don't do anything about it, then it's free for all. So anyway, I feel there's two main things that education needs to be concerned with. One is the critical thinking. We're always going to have STEM, or we're going to have whack-a-mole approaches to education on what they should learn. But I think it was Einstein said, education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And if we instill that in kids, they've got, more in their phone than they're ever going to know as far as information. So how to think about the information, what to do about it is far more important. And the other part is the ethical part about character development. There's groups called social emotional learning. That's one that's going in lots of parts of the country to have that invested in every subject in some way, look at the ethics within each subject. And they're making some headway. But we have nothing as a national sort of motivation to do anything. Obama mentioned that one thing, but then he's out, somebody else comes in, look who came in. You think he's going to worry about social emotional learning or character development? Probably not. But in any case, I think, it's a great place for humanists to have a voice. And that's all I have to say, but thank you for listening and watching, folks. If you have any questions I can answer, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I already got Dave, and you're already unmuted, so you can just go ahead.
Yeah, you had mentioned like cheating in schools, and I was wondering, when you said, if the kids are cheating in schools, it shouldn't surprise anybody that, corporate people are behaving poorly as corporate citizens or whatever. And I wonder if maybe the car's going the other way, where kids are not, it's not that the kids cheating in school maybe caused the bad behavior in corporations, but maybe that bad behavior by adults in positions of power sort of teaches kids that it's okay to cheat.
I think you're right. I think, our role models leave something to be desired. When kids see it and they talk about it, if the adult can do it, why can't we?
All right, cool. I was just thinking maybe that car was going the other way. And so I thought I'd bring it up.
No, I agree with you.
All right. I'm going to mute Dave. And Emma, I think, here we go. Emma.
Okay, so I am also concerned about this cheating in school as well. Is it because they imitate from their parents? So what happened to these parents? Why they cheat so much? Another question I have has to do with the Holland School, the Children's Zone project. Mm-hmm. I know that they have more money. Is that how they fix the problem? It's just to hire more teachers and is there anything special they did?
Yes, they do have more money, and this is a case where throwing money at it works. It's not just the money, it's the design of the program. Like I said, they go to the preschool, and even pregnant moms will have a place to go to learn about childcare, to learn what they should do, as far as nutrition. It's an amazingly complete village, you might say, to raise a child in. And it costs money. And he showed the fellow who was a friend of his, they met in Harvard. He became a billionaire, and he threw a lot of money at Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone, as well as other nonprofit organizations that work with them. So I think if you have the idea that, character is important, and the finances to educate the child in both those things, in regular academic work as well as in their character development, then it's kind of unbeatable. You're going to get an awful lot more kids that are going to be good citizens as well as productive citizens.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Dana and Jerry. Here's Jerry.
Yeah, it's Jerry. You said earlier you thought the political situation in this country is the worst it's ever been. Can you say a little more about that and how that's relevant to our educational problems?
Well, at least in my memory, I've never seen as much polarization as there is today, and a kind of lack of concern for the country in general. But we have it seems like a great attachment for our tribe. There's political groups that are tribal, there are ethnic groups that are tribal, and we have less of a sense of sacrifice for the country as a whole. And it took a lot of sacrifice for that World War II generation to build all the schools, to hire all the teachers, to make that change from what was happening before. I mean, when you look at the incomes of those folks in those days, and the fact that they went through a depression, and then on the tail of that, they were in the middle of the biggest war the world has ever seen, and made all those sacrifices, and then coming out of that and saying, well, we've got these kids, now we have to educate, and schools we have to build. They were willing to make that sacrifice. And I see today there, and maybe this is just my particular prejudice, I just see a selfishness that I don't think existed then. Not that there wasn't prejudice, there was plenty of prejudice, but there was this idea that you come together for the good of the country and the survival of the country. Here, I'm not sure. I mean, now it just seems like a much more me, myself, and I kind of period in history, and it doesn't bode well for our country as a whole.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I have something to say. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. I just retired from 22 years of teaching at Palo Alto Adult School, English as a second language, and maybe that's a special situation. I'm not sure. But with this regard to Mr. Pannone saying there was certain kind of tribalism, I sort of noticed that sometimes in my classrooms. And, you know, we have this culture where individuals are supposed to compete to be the best all the time. But when you're doing ESL teaching, you're getting students who come from different cultural backgrounds, where the success of the group and not losing face and things like that is more important to them. And they will go to great lengths to assist each other to look good in class. And they don't regard it as cheating or anything. And so it's very hard to instill that particularly American competitive, I want to be first attitude in them, and say, oh, they think it's more important, in other words, to get a good result on the exams and quizzes than it really is about where the answer came from. And so I would get what I call group answers.
I agree, and it's the conflict we have between cultures, right? In Western culture, particularly American culture, it's the lone cowboy. It's the guy who's out there, doing it on his own. He doesn't need anybody. He's going to make it on his own. And then in Asian culture, for example, where the group is most important, you're going to make sacrifices for the group. And it's like a rising tide raises all boats. Well, if the group comes up, everybody feels good about it. But this idea that, we are the hero, and of course, the superhero is always popular in American culture, right? The Superman, Superwoman, whatever it is, they're the one that's praised. And of course, we give so much. Look at sports players. They get a ton of money if they're the best. And that's what we push. We're not pushing for the welfare of the group. We're trying to get everybody to compete with each other, and somehow that's going to fix things. Well, we managed to get a Jeff Bezos, who's the richest man on the planet. And people are inspired to be that kind of person rather than to help one another. So you bring up a good point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I really saw a lot of that in where that kind of very competitive person was regarded by some students as a selfish person that was only interested in themselves and their own success and they needed to have a higher or a broader moral or ethical standards and include everyone. So it's very interesting, what to do. I don't know.
Well, I think you have, like, if you look at Confucianism, right? That's still ingrained in many Asian kids, this concept of respect for family, of love for family, that they're there to support you, but it's a we, not a me. It's always extending to we, not just me.
All right. Moving on to Ray.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk. Very informative. I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up going to school in the 50s and 60s, and I could see a lot of parallels to what you're talking about and my personal experience. Not too many years ago, I saw a video on YouTube called The Dark Intentions of Public Schooling. And it was a video about how the political structure and the wealthy people that control the country intentionally tried to put down teaching critical thinking and tried to create a generation of people that would be good, obedient factory workers. And I don't know if you've seen that, but maybe you could comment on that particular facet of how the education system in the country was where it was during that period.
Yeah, I think it's very true. I didn't see the video, but I agree with that. I think especially before you had Benjamin Bloom come out with his taxonomy and about critical thinking, and like I said, the '64 revolt at Berkeley, where what they wanted was free speech to think critically, and then it gradually filtered down into the schools. But it kind of was stopped when you had Proposition 13 happen. The school classrooms exploded for numbers, and I taught critical thinking. I volunteered to do it because the kids really wanted it, and so I volunteered for 2 years to do it. They absolutely loved the class. And said, well, why don't we do this in other classes? Why don't we think about why we believe what we believe? Why do we just have to kind of regurgitate back what the book says on high stakes testing? And I tend to agree with that, with the, the film you're talking about. And I don't know that there's a great cabal that's trying to do it consciously, but it's kind of what happens, when you have a class of 40 kids. Anybody who's been in the military knows the larger the group, the more disciplined you have to be, and the less free thought there is in the group because you've got to have control. And so if you've got a class, like I've seen many classes, 35, 40 kids in the class, well, it's only the kids who are the most vociferous that are going to raise their hand and talk, and the rest of that's maybe 5 or 6 in the class, and the other 30 are going to just shut up and go along with the program. So I think it's true, whether again it's a plan or it just happened. I think it's real.
Yeah, I think from what I saw growing up in that area and thinking back about it, I think it was definitely part of the plan. And I put a link to the video in the chat. And it's about 8 minutes. I encourage everybody to watch it because I think it will shed some light on things.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to Michael Abramson. Michael, should be able to unmute.
Yeah.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have more questions than I can keep in my memory, but two of them that in the first video that you showed, they left out, in my opinion, the most critical question is how our public schools are funded. So I suppose that a part of this funding, or maybe the most part of this funding, is coming from dispersal taxes, right? Is anything coming from the county or from the state, or is there some option to utilize this funding?
Michael, I have a breakdown of it. I wanted to show that. It's a pie chart. I'm looking now to try and see if I can give you exact numbers on it. But it basically turned upside down, proposition turned upside down what had existed before. You had property taxes funding 58 or 59% of education, and the state spending about 30 or contributing 30%. Then there was federal government, maybe 8%, local taxes of I think 7 or 8%, something like that. And then the lottery contributing 1%. That was the biggest scam they ever put on us, was the lottery. Now it's reversed between the state and the parcel tax. The property taxes are 30%. The state is about 60 now. And that gives a distribution of a little over $12,000 per student around the state. And after that, you have bond issues. This is where the suburban schools, particularly, that are in good areas, they will float bond issues, and that's for buildings, it's for teacher salaries. So there's still a great disparity. I don't know if I mentioned Los Gatos, Saratoga School District, high school district. They get $14,500. It's 2,000 more than the state is contributing. That's regular. That's not even counting for the extras that they will ask the voters for. And people are willing to vote for them. That's the thing. I think it was 200 bond issues for local school districts that people were anxious to pass because they felt those monies would be well used. But that doesn't happen for the most part in your difficult school districts, ones that are crying for more funding. But it does work particularly well in suburban districts where you have a population that's really interested in education. They'll pass those bond issues. And I think I did some judging for a music program at Saratoga High. They just spent about $10 million for a new music wing. It's phenomenal. It's better than most colleges I've ever seen. But those are bond issues that the voters are willing to pass. And they get a good deal the way they look at it. The average high school private average is $21,000 a year. It goes all the way up to $55,000 for some high-end high schools. So if you can go to a good school, and the regular taxes are paying $12,500, and you put in another couple thousand, you're getting a great education. That's an incredible bargain you're getting for your kids' education. So to me, that's why voters are willing to do it. But again, that willingness is for your own kid. The extension of it being for somebody else's kid, that's another issue.
Yeah, I understand this, but why cannot the state use this 60% to equalize this funding and to throw more money to the school districts that are at disadvantaged positions?
Yeah, they have tried to do that, Michael. They tried. This was before Prop 13 and after, with some Supreme Court, California Supreme Court decisions. I don't have it in front of me, but they tried to level it out to give a greater proportion to city schools or schools that weren't being funded. But it doesn't come up. It still doesn't come up to the level of good suburban schools, or if you're in a wealthy area in a city. It doesn't match that. And when you think of it, $12,000 or $12,500, whatever it comes down to, a good portion of that, unfortunately, goes to downtown administrations. And that takes a big chunk. When I was teaching, and the state or the ADA, what we call the average daily attendance money from each kid, came to $9,000. Well, $4,500 went downtown, and $4,500 went to the school. So half the money went downtown to administration, and we only got $4,500 per kid to teach the kid. So the rubber hits the road in the classroom with the teacher and the kid, right? But yet these administrations are taking a big chunk of that. But that's the nature of bureaucracy. So I wish it were different. But then you have school boards. Remember that if you have a small community in a school board, that school board is directly responsible to you. But in a large city, all those school board members are elected by their constituents, which could be different ethnic groups. And so in city schools, you'll have minority populations in different schools that basically own a school board member. And the monies will, kind of drift into that area. So the politics of it is very unfortunate. And I don't know any remedy for that, unfortunately.
And my another question was this Harlem's project. Was there any attempt to replicate it in other places,
Yes,
successful, unsuccessful?
Yes, there are. There are about 5 cities. The names are different, and they're all successful. All of them are successful, the cities that are doing it. It's just that it's difficult to convince people, that it's going to cost money to do this. And where you have nonprofits that put money into it, or in his case, a billionaire that came along and said, this is well worthwhile, I'm going to put my money into it. It does work, and he's proven it work. Over 20 years, he's gotten thousands of kids through this. They graduated from college, they've got good jobs, they've beat all the odds. So, if like I say, about five cities have duplicated this in similar form. And it works, but we just got to be willing to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Whoops. Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, I finally did it. Yeah, hey, Jerry. I had one interesting thought. I'm trying to change the subject a little bit. My sister was a elementary school principal for about 35 years in Los Angeles. And her biggest complaint was that she had a wide range of students in her community. Her community consisted of a bunch of very rich people, wealthy people, let's just say highly educated, highly paid techies, and then a bunch of persons that came over the border. And there was a big disparity there. And the problem there that she found most frustrating was the differences between the parents in the two groups. That's also another challenge. I don't know, have you heard anybody trying to achieve a balance like that in California? Because I know it probably happens in more than one city. Certainly SF has that problem.
Yeah, it's difficult. If she was a principal and had those two groups, it's very, very hard because, obviously the kid coming from a wealthy family, an educated family, is going to be way ahead of that kid who, he's struggling with language, and the parents aren't highly educated. That's where, if she can get money, or if she was able to, then in a sense, it's a microcosm of the state, right? We've got 54% Latinos in the state now in the schools, 54%. And I find it ironic that, you know, the money started drying up as the state got browner, you know. That's what happened. It started drying up as you had more and more brown folks coming into the system. And Jeffrey Canada Harlem Children's Zone is showing a way to do it, but within the same system, it's difficult. And that's where, you know, again, you go back to tribalism. These folks who are wealthy and they're in the same school, what I find they try to do is give their kids a lot of advantages, because we all do, right? We want our kid to have advantages. But unless they can extend that to the other kid sitting next to him who doesn't have the, you know, the props and the advantages that your kid does, it's really difficult. You can make it work in some, you can go out on a project and make it work. If you're out gardening, that rich kid and the poor kid together, they're going to be doing fine. But get them into an academic setting where it requires background, it's super hard. And this was the mainstream idea. They did it with handicapped kids. The whole idea, and also the idea behind integration, right? That you couldn't get a good education unless you were integrated into that other school. That separate but equal doesn't work. I think separate but equal does work, but we don't like to admit it. I taught in Oakland with all black kids. It was a better school I was teaching in than my own kid was going to. And the kids had more spirit. They were totally into everything they were doing because they had a couple great teachers. I can't say if those kids had been in my school, my kids' school, they would have been better off. They would have been worse off. They were in a really good environment. And this is what Jeffrey Canada is trying to do with the Harlem Children's Zone. He's given up on this idea, oh, we have to bus these kids to white schools. No, you have to educate the kid that's in front of you. Do the best job you possibly can. If it takes more money, give them more money. Just give them more money and let them do it. And that's what I think the problem is. They were afraid to move those Latino kids to another classroom and give them what they needed. They wanted them to be together because that's the American dream, integration, be together. Well, there's classism in the American space where we want everybody to be together, but we ignore that there's classism. If you go to Silicon Valley, a lot of other schools, high number of Asians, right? Your own neighborhoods. If you live in a tech neighborhood, you've got Pakistanis, you've got Koreans, you've got Chinese, you've got Indians. They're all working in Silicon Valley. That's a class of people. It has nothing to do with poverty. That's a class, an educated class. Everybody gets along because you're an educated class. The other way doesn't work. It simply doesn't. It's an expectation that people like to dream of. Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. Really? You ever see anything in nature that says that? Maybe the soul, just a spiritual idea, but nothing in nature is created equal. Some trees are bigger, some mountains are bigger, some animals are stronger. So we labor on this dream on the left, it's particularly on the left, right? We labor about this dream and we try to make it happen, but it doesn't work. And so we're not willing to say why it doesn't work. If we ask ourselves why it doesn't work, it's kind of obvious. That kid didn't get the advantages. But then are we willing to pay for them to make it happen? And I think that's where the rub is. We're just not willing to pay for it.